Ruth, chapter 1. All of chapter 1. It's slightly shorter than the book of Matthew, page 411 in the Pew Bible. We're probably on the one chapter per week plan, but I guess we'll see. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So today we begin a journey in the book of Ruth, most likely quite a bit shorter than our journey in the book of Matthew. I have difficulty picking a single favorite of anything. Don't ask me what my favorite food is. I don't know. But Ruth is definitely one of my favorite books in the Bible. Now, a year ago, if I was talking about this, having difficulty picking a favorite, I would have made the joke that that's maybe why I'm not married yet. But There's an exception for that, right? But with everything else, favorite foods, favorite colors, favorite verses in the Bible, don't ask because I don't know. But this is a beautiful book. There are plenty of books of historical narrative in the Bible. Most of them chronicle like big events that affected a lot of people. But Ruth focuses on the personal details of one family with its ups and downs. And then you see like the cultural details. There's some really interesting stuff there. And then at the very end, it connects this story to the larger story of Israel and thereby connects it to God's story of redemption. But most of it, it has this really narrow focus on this one family, and it's a really beautiful thing. Ruth is a story of loyalty and love, a story of the love between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. Always special when that actually happens. But what comes out of that is a love story between Ruth, a young widow, and her future husband, Boaz. Ruth is the story of a young lady from a pagan culture who comes to faith in the one true God. Ruth forsakes her gods to take refuge under the wings of the God of Israel in a time when the nation of Israel was pretty inconsistent about following the God who had called her out of Egypt. Ruth is a story of redemption, of those in need being redeemed and rescued from their plight by a kinsman redeemer, a close relative who could help. It points to a greater redemption when the Messiah came from the family line of this very couple, Ruth and Boaz, to redeem and rescue us from our plight. Ruth is a story of contrasts between fullness and emptiness, between bitterness and joy, and between harvest and famine. We got both of those in this chapter. Actually, all 6 of those. Fullness, emptiness, bitterness, joy, famine, and harvest. Naomi becomes bitter with God for what has happened in her life, but she doesn't see the blessings that really are right around the corner. Ruth is a story that speaks of a king that is to come. Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David, who fathers a dynasty of kings. And then ultimately the Messiah, Jesus, comes from her family line. Finally, Ruth is a story of ironic humor. Did you pick up on that? Pick up on that? The problem is that we don't speak Hebrew. And if you don't know the meaning of the names in the story, then you won't get the joke. But believe me, there's plenty of humor in the book of Ruth. There are only 2 books in the Bible named after women, Ruth and Esther. Ruth is focused very much on the women in the story, especially Naomi and her daughter-in-law. If you notice at the very beginning, Elimelech is the central character of the story, but he doesn't last very long in the story. And then, after the first few verses, Naomi and Ruth are the central characters. Naomi and her family start in Bethlehem. Then they sojourn in Moab for about 10 years, and then Naomi and Ruth come back to Bethlehem. Bethlehem is a town to the west and a little south of the northern tip of the Dead Sea, and Moab was a nation to the east of the Dead Sea. So if my hand is the Dead Sea, I'll do it backwards for your sake. Bethlehem is around about there. Moab is like over here, right? We don't know exactly where in Moab. The language seems to imply in the plain of Moab, so somewhere in the flat land. Moab was a polytheistic pagan nation whose chief god was called Chemosh. The people of Moab descended from Lot, Abraham's nephew, and there are some sketchy details in there. Um, when Lot escaped from Sodom with his two daughters, they hid out in a cave for a while. It's possible that the two daughters, having witnessed the destruction of Sodom, thought that there are no men left in the world except for our father, and so they conspired to get their dad drunk and make babies. So Moab is descended from that sketchy encounter there. There may have been peaceful relations between Israel and Moab at times, but there were significant periods of time when they were at war with each other or in conflict, and a long period when Israel was ruling over Moab. The conflict between Israel and Moab started when the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt through the ministry of Moses. The Moabites felt threatened by the presence of Israel camping near their borders, and Balak, king of Moab, hired a pagan prophet named Balaam to curse Israel. Yeah, this is the guy with the talking donkey. And the prophet found himself unable to curse and could only bless Israel. After this, the Moabites tried a different approach. The young ladies of Moab seduced the men of Israel and then led them away from the Lord to worship a false god. And that led to judgment against Israel because of their unfaithfulness. That's in Numbers 25, verses 1 through 3. In Deuteronomy 23, 3 through 5, as a result, Moses said, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you." So because of her ancestry, Ruth was excluded from the assembly of the Lord down to the 10th generation. Now there are some who would argue that that applied specifically to men and not to women. But be that as it may, what happened here, though, is that because Ruth left her people and joined herself to the Lord and his people Israel, she was not only accepted into the assembly of the Lord, but, get this, her great-great-grandson, King Solomon, built the temple of God. So that's a big shift from, no Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. She wasn't a Moabite anymore. She had turned away from her former religion and come to faith in the one true God. The book of Ruth makes no claim about who wrote it. The Jewish Talmud, written many, many years later, over a millennium, claims that the prophet Samuel wrote the book of Ruth, and that's a possibility. But in reality, we don't know with any certainty, especially since the Talmud was written long, long after Ruth was written. Ruth begins with, "In the days when the judges ruled." So after the days of Moses, Joshua led Israel into the promised land. After Joshua died, a series of judges ruled over all or part of Israel. Some of them only had a local sphere of authority, though some ruled over larger areas or maybe even over all of Israel. The Lord's will for his people was not that they have human kings and a large centralized government, but that they serve the Lord their God and hail him as king and follow his ways. Unfortunately, the time period of the judges was characterized by constant wandering and spiritual degeneracy. There was a constant wavering between following the Lord and wandering away from him, though, let's be honest, that could describe a lot of nations and a lot of time periods. The last verse of the book of Judges summarizes the time period with these words. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. You could approach that in a very naive way and think it sounds great. The same summary is given in whole or in part 3 other times in the book of Judges. Israel was called to follow the Lord as their God and king and to follow his ways, but instead, this is the situation. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. As Trump would say, not good. I can't really do it in his accent and all that. The book of Ruth introduces a character named Elimelech, whose name means God is king. Oh, well, that seems relevant, isn't it? Elimelech's name ironically points right to the chief problem of the time period. So in the beginning of the book, both the connection to the book of Judges and the name Elimelech highlight that there was a fundamental problem in the nation at that time, that they weren't consistently following the Lord as their heavenly king, and they didn't have an earthly king, whether good or bad. In the last verse of the book, it is revealed that Ruth's great-grandson is David, the king after God's own heart. So the Lord provided the nation with a good earthly king, far from perfect. David fathered a dynasty of kings, some of whom were good, and ultimately David would be the ancestor of the Messiah, the eternal King of Kings, Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our Lord, the Son of God. So through Ruth, the Lord would provide a king who is both God and man, a leader who can truly do a perfect job of leading his people rightly. There have been many leaders, judges and kings who have been good or mostly good, and many also who have not been good. But the Lord alone is the good shepherd who always knows perfectly what is best for his flock. Ruth begins with, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Most of the names in this book have significant meanings. Some of the meanings are ironic, and some are not. The name Bethlehem means house of bread. House of bread. So yes, the book starts out with a famine in Bethlehem, the house of bread. As I said, ironic humor. So there's irony for you. So something has gone wrong. In the very place called House of Bread, which should have been characterized by, plentiful supplies of grain, there is a famine. When faced with famine, Elimelech, Mr. God is King, takes his family to a land where a false god is worshipped, which seems like kind of a questionable choice. Naomi means pleasant, and her 2 sons are called Mahlon and Chilion, which translate to sick and pining or failing. Why? I listened to a sermon on Ruth where the preacher nicknamed the sons sick and tired. Perfect. That's close enough. And it's pretty catchy, so we'll go with it. I'm not certain what was going through Naomi's head when she named her sons sick and tired, but perhaps the names were descriptive of Naomi's experience with childbearing and childbirth. I don't know. And that may explain why she only had 2 sons. I'm sure it came as a complete shock when you found out that the boy's name, Sick and Tired, did not turn out to be very long-lived. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. All 3 of the men in Naomi's life died. In verse 21, when she came back to Bethlehem, she described this experience by saying, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." Now, while we're at it, we may as well say that Ruth's name means friendship, very appropriate. Orpah means gazelle. You can run with that very quickly wherever you want. At the end, the gazelle ran away. Ironically, maybe it's not ironic, I don't know. So in our Bibles, Ruth comes right after the book of Judges, which, it is connected to that, so that kind of makes sense. In Hebrew Bibles, Ruth comes after the book of Song of Songs, and there's a mention of a gazelle. It's a different word in the last verse of Song of Songs. So there you go. And while we're having a little fun, we may as well mention that if you're typing about this, every time you type Orpah, spell check will correct it to Oprah, and that actually was the problem that Oprah Winfrey's mother faced. She originally named her daughter Orpah, and no one could get it right, and so Oprah stuck. So there you go. We, Naomi said, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." We can't really blame Naomi for focusing on all that she had lost. Her husband and both her sons. I think we all have times like that when all we see is our loss or the problem that's in front of us, whatever it is. But what she has lost is not even close to being the whole story. She may have gone away full with a husband and 2 sons and came back empty as far as the men in her life. But there's more to the story than that. She went away with a husband and 2 sons, so in that sense she was full. Her family was full, but her stomach was empty because of famine. So there's an opposite thing going on. Whereas she came home empty in one way, but she came home in the midst of the barley harvest as it was beginning, which tells you that there's something new happening. A new time of blessing has come. Naomi has one story in her head that she had lost everyone in her life and that God was against her. And, she's stuck in this story. She said in verse 21, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi," which means pleasant? "The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." And earlier than that, she had said, "Call me Mara," that means bitter. The author of Ruth doesn't tell us if there was a spiritual cause behind the deaths of the men in Naomi's life. But clearly Naomi felt that God was against her. And you know what? If we feel angry with God or resentful or bitter or feel like he's against us, like, things have not gone our way, the Lord can surely handle our feelings. There's no good trying to hide them from him. The only thing to do is to bring them to him and address the issue instead of letting it sit and ignoring it. There are times when an answer doesn't come right away. And that's difficult. You have to imagine Abraham when the Lord gave him a promise of a son, and then he had to wait and wait and wait and wait some more. How did he feel about that? Did he lose faith? Did he get upset about it? So to be honest, for many years, at least 10 years, probably more, I had at least a little bit of bitterness towards the Lord in my heart. I was trusting in the Lord to provide a wife for me, and I felt like he wasn't coming through. And anything I tried to maybe meet people or something always failed. I'd do some activity or something, and find not specifically for that, but hoping maybe the Lord would come through in that, and then I'd find myself surrounded by people twice my age. What's going on here? I continued serving the Lord, but there was a place in my relationship with him that was hurt and that was hurting and continued hurting. I was looking for a girl I had a lot in common with. And then, fast forward to April 27th of now it's last year, the Lord brought Kristen back into my life after being out of touch for 20 years. And the first thing she said to me was, "Wow, we really have a lot in common." Well, yeah, that got my attention. And now we just got engaged 3 days ago. And the Lord has confirmed many times that this is from him, that doesn't make it perfect, We could certainly mess it up, but we have a good start. When I was in the midst of all those years of waiting, they may have seemed like wasted time to me at times, but all that time the Lord was preparing both of us. Kristen and I really fit together well now, with a whole lot of common interests and values. But the reality is that much of what we have in common is something that has developed during the time of waiting, that wasn't actually there when we were friends 21 years ago. Truly, the Lord was preparing us, and he's doing wonderful things now. So I may have been a bit bitter with the Lord because I felt like I was just waiting and nothing was happening, and I was powerless to make something happen. But the reality is that the Lord was working the entire time. I couldn't see the results yet, but he was preparing the soil and planting the seed for a time of harvest. And now the harvest is beginning, and it was worth the wait. What we see from our earthly perspective is not the whole story. Naomi didn't see the whole story. I didn't see the whole story. If we're bitter with the Lord or angry, we need to come to him with those emotions. He can surely handle them, and we really need his help to begin to understand that there's more to our story than what we see. There was abundant provision and blessing coming Naomi's way, but she couldn't see it yet. She had no idea. Naomi had 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, gazelle and friendship, married to sick and tired, until they got a little too sick and a little too tired. When Orpah finally left to go back to her family, Naomi said to Ruth, "Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods." So both of them, in some sense, left their pagan gods behind when they married into Naomi's family. To what extent is another question. Was it sincere or not? Both of them left their gods behind to some extent, but the proof is in the pudding. After her husband died, Orpah, she initially followed Naomi, but And in the end, she went back to where she had come from. And she went back to the paganism she had come from, and Ruth did not. That tells you a lot about whether each of them actually left their pagan roots behind or just put on a show of doing so. Ruth was walking into the unknown with no assurance of provision, no assurance that the future held something other than poverty. Any assurance she had must have come from the Lord. In that time, there were not a lot of job opportunities for women. It would have been very difficult for a woman to provide for herself and live independently. You know, we're talking about a mainly agrarian culture, so it's hard work. So Ruth truly is taking a leap into the unknown out of love and loyalty. What she does here should not be minimized in any way. She's really going out there. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." That's really beautiful. Ruth not only leaves her family and her people behind, but she fully forsakes her pagan roots and completely embraces the one true God. We need to come to the Lord, forsaking any false gods who may have been in our past and leaving them behind. Like Ruth left all that behind. Ruth came across great blessings when she stepped out into the unknown in faith out of love and loyalty for her mother-in-law. And all of us who truly step out in faith will meet a blessing. Whether it's immediate or maybe it's something that takes some time. Maybe it takes a lot of time. With a daughter-in-law like Ruth, Naomi wasn't nearly as empty as she thought she was. There was a whole lot more to the story than she was able to see or that she could grasp at that time. And the Lord was not against her. Amen?